Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister please explain to the Australian people why it is government policy to forgive businesses who have illegally failed to pay their employees superannuation for over 25 years by waiving all penalties and rewarding them with tax deductions?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the government has done more than any of its predecessors to crack down on corporate tax avoidance. And, Mr Speaker, when the multinational tax avoidance legislation was presented at the end of 2015, legislation which, together with accompanying new laws, has brought $7 billion of revenue back into the Australian corporate tax net. It was the Labor Party that voted against it. The Labor Party was then voting on behalf of tax dodgers. That's what they did. They had the opportunity to support us in cracking down on tax avoidance, and they failed to rise to the occasion. Now, we have ensured that we do everything we can to provide businesses with the incentive to invest and to employ. We believe in lower taxes,
Members on my
but
left.
we believe that everybody should pay their tax in accordance with the law.
Member for
The
Gorton is
Labor
warned.
Party, on the other hand, stands for higher taxes, less investment, fewer jobs and lower paid
The Prime
jobs.
Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, on the point of relevance, I was asking about the government's Treasury Laws Amendment 2018 superannuation measures, and why is this Prime Minister giving a leave pass to dodgy bosses?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, if I may just,
The member for Lindsay will cease interjecting.
Speaker. Mr Speaker, we should not forget
Member for
that
Griffith.
it was the Leader of the Opposition, when he was in government, who removed the protections for people with low balance superannuation accounts. Well, he did. He did indeed. His legislation failed to protect people with low balance superannuation accounts, a matter that is being addressed by the government's superannuation reforms.
Members on both sides, the Treasurer, the Leader of the House. The level of interjections is already too high. I just make it very clear to all of those interjecting, particularly those who interject regularly, that I will act swiftly. I'm not going to interrupt ministers answering questions with every interjection. I've mentioned a number of people and warned the member for Gorton. I now call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on the action the government is taking to ensure Australians keep more of their money they earn and get the essential services they expect, including in my electorate of Robertson? And is the Prime Minister aware of any threats to this agenda?
The Prime Minister has the
For
call.
a question. Mr Speaker, the budget is our plan for a stronger economy. It delivers on the promises we made in 2016 for more jobs and more growth. Jobs and growth is what we promised, and that's precisely what has been delivered. Record jobs growth, the largest number of jobs created in any calendar year in Australia's history. 2017, 415,000 jobs. And Mr Speaker, our income tax plan is a major comprehensive reform. It means lower, fairer and simpler taxes for middle and lower income Australians, with 10 million Australians benefiting in the first year and nearly 4.5 million receiving relief of $530. And Mr Speaker, because it is a plan a comprehensive plan, it will mean at the conclusion of the plan in 24-25, 94% of Australians will not have to pay more than 32.5 cents in the dollar for an extra dollar of income. Between $41,000 and $200,000, a marginal rate of 32.5 cents. And, Mr Speaker, we're also ensuring that we're cracking down on costly and unfair fees and charges on superannuation accounts. And, Mr Speaker, we are banning exit fees for anyone who simply wants to change their fund. That's costing Australians around $52 million a year at the moment. We're introducing a 3% cap on administration of fees on accounts with a balance of $6,000 or less, and that would have saved Australians around $120 million in 2015-16. And most importantly, Mr Speaker, we're ensuring that lost and inactive superannuation accounts can be transferred to the Australian Taxation Office and then proactively reunited with the account holder's active account. And that will send back nearly $6 billion to around 3 million Australians. And that is real relief for Australian superannuation account holders. And, Mr Speaker, the strength in the economy that we're seeing that is delivering the record jobs growth is enabling us to guarantee essential services with record spending, whether it is on health, on education or on infrastructure. And, Mr Speaker, we've seen on health in particular the wonderful new life-saving drugs listed on the PBS. We're able to do that because we have the budget under control and we're able to manage it in a way that delivers life-saving drugs for so many Australians, drugs that would not have been listed under the Labor Party under their mismanagement of the health system.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer the Prime Minister to his own government's legislation currently before the Parliament. Is the Prime Minister even aware that it is now government policy to reward dodgy businesses who have robbed workers by failing to pay their superannuation for more than 25 years, by not only waiving all penalties for the businesses but also giving them a tax deduction as well?
The Minister for Financial Services. The member for Wakefield, a member shortened, I should say. He's warned. Sorry, Wakefield just runs off the tongue so easily. Member for Shortland is warned. The Minister for Financial Services.
I thank the Shadow Treasurer.
The Minister will resume her seat. The member for McMahon, I refer him to my statements I've made to him after previous points of order. Member for McMahon. On
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is, of course, completely within the Prime Minister's right to refer the question to another minister. But it was about what he was.
The Minister will just pause for a second. This came up last week, and I'm just going to again refer the member for McMahon to the practice. I'll even dig out the page if he wants, that the Prime Minister can refer a question to any minister. The Minister has the call.
I thank the Shadow Treasurer for his question, and I refer him to my press release on the 24th of May 2018. It is very clear that the government is not letting anybody off the hook from paying the superannuation guarantee entitlements that they ought to pay. Far from it. This government has put in place a mechanism to allow small and medium-sized businesses who otherwise have not paid superannuation guarantee entitlements to come forward under an amnesty and make good every single dollar that they owe their workers. And why? Why are we doing this? We are doing this because we actually care about the superannuation entitlements of
the Minister
every
will pause.
single worker.
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Members on both sides. The member for Shortland couldn't have had a more public warning. He continues to interject. He will leave under 94A. The Minister has the call.
And so why is it that we are doing this? We are doing it
The Minister has the call. Minister has the call.
Why is it that we're doing it? It is because on this side of the chamber we actually care about the superannuation savings of millions of Australians. Unlike those opposite, when the Leader of the Opposition was Minister for Financial Services, he himself, with his changes, uncapped fees. He put young Australians, those Australians under the age of 25 and low-income workers, into insurance arrangements that would cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars in retirement. He did this. Why? Maybe it was to support some of his mates in the superannuation sector. Maybe it was to do that. We have announced reforms in our most recent budget where we are reuniting people with their own
The
money.
member for Burt will leave under 94A.
$6 billion to more than 3 million Australians. And we are doing this because we recognise that superannuation is not the government's money, it is not the employer's money, it is not the union's money, and it's not Labor's money. It is the members' money.
The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the government is keeping taxes under control and providing tax relief to hard-working Australians, including in my electorate of Chisholm? Would a different approach produce a better result?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Chisholm for her question. The government has a tax plan, a personal tax plan for all working Australians, because all working Australians who pay tax work, and they all deserve to benefit from a personal tax plan, that gives them relief. Over the next 10 years, those working Australians will pay more than $3,000 billion in personal income tax over the next decade. Now, we believe a personal tax plan that affords them $140 billion worth of personal tax relief is a great step forward, Mr Speaker. So I was surprised when the opposition came in here and tried to strip that plan by a half. They sought and they voted to strip out $70 billion worth of tax relief for hard-working Australians, to take a $140 billion plan for tax relief and turn it into a $70 billion plan. That's what they've done with the tax plan. They've halved the amount of tax relief, Mr Speaker, that we're seeking to provide. Now, Mr Speaker, that plan involves step one, as we know, to provide low to middle income earners with tax relief, some 60,000 in the member for Chisholm's electorate, Mr Speaker. But step two, which the Labor Party sought to strip out, does this. It protects those working Australians from the impacts of bracket creep, which strips away their hard-earned, as their wages only have to increase by inflation, Mr Speaker. And what the Labor Party want to do is claw that all back in bracket creep and spend all the money. What it means is, under step two of our plan, that someone who is earning $76,000 today, $76,000 under our plan will pay no more than 32.5 cents over the next decade, Mr Speaker. You know what they'll pay under the Labor Party? They'll pay 37 cents in the future, Mr Speaker. Someone on $76,000 today. Now, step three, Mr Speaker. Step three, as the Prime Minister said, ensures that 94% of Australians will pay no more than 32.5 cents in the dollar. And that includes someone who is on an average wage today of full-time earnings of $84,600. Now, under Labor's plan, in the future, they will pay 37 cents. Under our plan, they'll pay 32.5 cents, Mr Speaker. So our personal tax plan is anchored in middle-income Australia, Mr Speaker. Those opposite want to strip away the hard-earned wages of Australians by clawing it back and tax back, Mr Speaker. And we only have to look no further than the member for Batman to understand why, who said this back in 2016. She said, "We need to stop talking about tax as a burden," she says. Tax, as I apologise, this is a direct quote, Mr Speaker, she says tax is a bloody privilege. Mr Speaker, under the Labor Party, if tax is a privilege, it'll be a very privileged place.
Members on both sides, just before I call the member for Hotham, we can keep coming up. I'm just, for the sake of all, the Leader of the House. I'm just going to make the point to the Treasurer and to all members of the House that using unparliamentary language, you can't use a quote to bring unparliamentary language into the House. And I'm going to make that point. It was undesirable language. Otherwise, the logical conclusion is you could find a quote from outside the House that says almost anything. You cannot get around unparliamentary language, and I'm going to make that point as clearly as I can. And I wouldn't. If members on my right can just, the member for Barker and others can at least allow me to finish the ruling, make the point that I won't allow that again. I'll take action. The member for Hotham has the call.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware of ABC reports that Jesse, a barman, was left with just $98 in super after working for more than 12 years because he was ripped off by dodgy businesses? Why is the Prime Minister rewarding dodgy businesses who have stolen the retirement savings of workers like Jesse by not only waiving all penalties for them, but giving them a tax deduction as well?
Yeah. Members on both sides, the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I couldn't hear the honourable member. She referred to a constituent called Jesse, who she said had been ripped off, but I couldn't hear who she said she'd been ripped off by.
I'll ask the member for. I remind members not to interject. Member for Isaacs in particular. I would have thought those on my left would be interested in maximising the number of questions in question time, but if the member for Isaacs wishes to delay it, the member for Hotham can repeat the question from the beginning.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware of ABC reports that Jesse, a barman, was left with just $98 in super after working for more than 12 years because he was ripped off by dodgy businesses? Why is the Prime Minister rewarding dodgy businesses who have stolen the retirement savings of workers like Jesse by not only waiving all penalties for them, but giving them a tax deduction as well?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the honourable member for a question. And firstly, in respect to the last part of her question, I'd refer her to the answer given a moment ago by the Minister for Revenue. And the arrangements that the minister described are designed to ensure that employees get all of their money and the interest back. It's designed to ensure. It is a 12-month amnesty on fines in respect of fines payable to government, not to employees, but in providing the incentive to encourage them to bring forward their payments and pay the money to employees. So it's designed to ensure that people like Jesse actually get what they deserve. So that's the goal of the change. That's the first point. Now, with respect to the honourable member's reference to dodgy businesses, it's difficult to comment on that detail, but I just would, other than to say that we are doing everything to ensure that Australian superannuation is protected. Honourable members will be familiar with the interim report from the Productivity Commission that's been released today, and be aware that the government has, in anticipation of many of those concerns, already introduced legislation which we encourage the opposition to support. For example, which is, as I described earlier, which is banning exit fees, increasing the ability of the ATO to reunite lost accounts, one of the points the Productivity Commission referred to, and making insurance through superannuation opt-in for members who are under the age of 25 or who have inactive accounts. But, Mr Speaker, in making this observation, I can add to an answer I gave earlier. The reality is, in 2013, as part of the so-called My Super reforms, the Labor Party, Labor government, repealed the members' protection standards. And those standards protected accounts. Well, the honourable member can shake her head, but I think this may very well apply to Jesse. Those standards protected accounts below $1,000 or accounts held in eligible rollover funds for erosion by requiring that fees do not exceed investment earnings. Now, from 1 July next year, under our plan, members with balances below $6,000 will not be charged administration and investment fees greater than 3% of their balance. And that is the coalition giving members with low balances protection that the Labor Party had stripped away.
The member for Denison has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the NDIS is obviously a great reform, but just as obviously too many people trying to access the scheme are hitting a bureaucratic brick wall. For example, there's the long wait to get an NDIS planner, problems staying in touch with the planner once you get one, and difficulties understanding the finished plan. Moreover, reasonable requests are too often denied, and it's especially telling that the NDIA is spending $10 million a year on legal battles to try and stop people getting funding, fights it's often losing. Prime Minister, what will you do to fix the NDIS?
The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. The government is absolutely committed to the NDIS. It is one of the most important social and economic reforms in our nation's history. It is changing lives and changing lives for the better. On Friday, I was with the member for Robertson, where we met, where in that electorate around 2,900 people are expected to benefit from the NDIS, and we were delighted to see together first-hand with the New South Wales Premier the work of participants at Fairhaven and Point Clare. And we met with Alexander Koppelman and the team at the Options Theatre, really inspiring people, and they are benefiting from the NDIS. Now, they represent some of the 162,000 Australians who are now accessing the NDIS, where a majority of people are receiving more support and obviously have greater choice and control. 84% of participants who entered the NDIS in the March quarter rated their experience as good or very good, and today the NDIS has released its quarterly report that shows that 44,945 people who had not been getting services from any government are now receiving support from the NDIS. Now, these are people who have significant and permanent disability but were left without any assistance in the community. Now, to demonstrate our commitment to the NDIS, we've sought to guarantee this essential service and give people certainty, and the certainty that it will be funded now into the future, as the Treasurer outlined in the budget, and certainty through the landmark bilateral agreement with New South Wales, which I signed with the Premier last week, that will deliver long-term funding and support for the NDIS in that state. Now, the level of support provided in a participant's plan is based on what's determined reasonable and necessary under the Act. And as of December 31, 2017, the total number of AAT appeals represented just 0.3% of all access decisions. As a nation, funding will increase.
Just to resume his seat for a second, the member for Denison on a point of order.
Speaker, on relevance, the question goes to the difficulties being experienced by some people, not the great experience that others are having.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a nation, funding will increase from around $8 billion a year to around $22 billion when it's fully rolled out. The NDIA, in response to feedback from participants and providers that their experience was not meeting the high standards expected, undertook the Pathways Review. And in response to that review, the agency has been developing and trialling a new model which includes more face-to-face planning to ensure people are listened to and, as a result, receive better quality plans and a more consistent point of contact, as well as clearer communication to participants. So the authority and the government are committed to ensuring that the NDIS is rolled out and that people get the support and service that they're entitled to. And I thank the honourable member for his question.
The member for Dunkley has the call, and the member for Jagga Jagga is warned.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the government is investing in nation-building, job-creating infrastructure? What other alternatives are there?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Dunkley for his question. Mr Speaker, he's a good member, and he knows that this government has the back of Victorians. This government has the back of everyone in Australia who wants infrastructure to build jobs, to build this nation, to build our future. The Liberal and Nationals government is committed, and we are absolutely investing in more than $75 billion through our 10-year, decade-long infrastructure investment pipeline. 10-year plan to bust congestion in our capital cities and in our regions, connect those communities that absolutely are looking for connection to ports, to further markets, to take advantage of what the Trade Minister and the Assistant Trade Minister, the member for Hinkler, are doing, all while creating tens of thousands of jobs. 1 million jobs brought about 5 months earlier than what we anticipated, more jobs for local businesses, more jobs for local communities. And when we talk about the state of Victoria, we look at the $12.9 billion to key infrastructure projects, including $5 billion for the Melbourne Airport rail link, announced by the Prime Minister just recently, up to $1.75 billion towards the North East Link, $475 million towards planning and pre-construction works for Monash Rail, all of which are going to drive jobs creation. We are delivering. We are delivering. I'm asked about Tasmania. I was there yesterday and the day before. I met with Jeremy Rockcliffe, the Deputy Premier, the Minister for Infrastructure. We talked about the infrastructure needs of the Apple Isle and what a great job Will Hodgman and his Liberal government are doing down there. As well, I had discussions with the candidate for Braddon, Brett Whiteley, about mass highway funding, and he understands the critical importance of infrastructure funding. And I stood there with Brett, with Senator Richard Colbeck and local mayors Darren Quillam and Robbie Walsh at Wynyard to discuss infrastructure for our region. And later, I discussed it with Senator Stephen Martin, a new voice for Tasmania in the government. Now, in Tasmania, $461 million to replace the Bridgewater Bridge, a fundamental piece of infrastructure. $400 million under the Roads of Strategic Importance. A Tasmanian roads package is going to make such a difference. Midland Highway, Bass Highway, all the highways and byways in the Apple Isle. We're getting on with the job of building the infrastructure Tasmania needs, Victoria needs, this nation needs, building our future. But I'm asked about the alternatives. Well, the alternative is very bleak. The alternative is very bleak. In Tasmania, it's just a few $1 million promised compared to our $400 million roads project. The bleak opposite of those opposite the bleak future is there before me, Mr Speaker. A very bleak indeed, Mr Speaker. They stand for less jobs, for higher taxes. We stand for infrastructure.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. A dodgy employer who stole from their employer for over 25 years would almost certainly go to jail. So why then, under this Prime Minister, do dodgy businesses that steal superannuation from their workers get no penalty at all, but instead get rewarded with a tax deduction? Why is it always one rule for business and another rule for everyone else under this government?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. One of the ironies of politics today is that we have this former union leader, this former champion for the workers, who abandoned them again and again when he was leading the AWU, and now in this place, will not put workers first. He opposes our policies which are delivering record jobs growth. Every one of those jobs that's been created, every one is put at threat by Labor, is threatened by Labor and their anti-business, anti-investment, anti-jobs policy. Now, as to the question of unpaid superannuation guarantee payments, what the minister has done is introduce legislation which is designed to recover over $200 million, hopefully more, of unpaid contributions for the benefit of workers, for the benefit of employees. And what the government is foregoing as part of that amnesty is some fines. So the government is creating an amnesty
The member
in
for
order
Bruce
to
has already
recover
been warned. He'll
more
cease
money
interjecting.
for more workers. More money for more workers. And here, the champion of the workers doesn't want to help them out. Well, it won't come as a surprise to anyone who is a member of the AWU under his hopeless leadership.
The member for Forrest.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is working closely with our international partners to bring justice to the victims of the downing of MH17?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Forrest for this important question. Last Friday, the Australian government joined with the government of the Netherlands in asserting state responsibility of the Russian Federation for its role in the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines MH17 on the 17th of July 2014. We have officially informed the Russian Federation in Moscow, in Canberra and in The Hague of the findings of the Joint Investigation Team that the Buk missile that was deployed to shoot down the plane belonged to the Russian Army's 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade, that the missile system was transported from Russia into Ukraine and into territory that was controlled at the time by Russian-backed fighters, that a missile from that system was deployed to shoot down a passenger jet that was cruising at an altitude of 33,000 feet, that the missile system was then transported back into Russia immediately, that very same day. The decision to deploy an advanced, sophisticated military weapon directly led to the deaths of all 298 passengers and crew on board, including 38 people from Australia. Mr Speaker, the actions of the Russian Federation demand a response, and we have urged Russia to admit responsibility. We have called on Russia to enter into negotiations on matters relating to its conduct, including compensation for the victims' families. We've also called on Russia to comply with the unanimous UN Security Council Resolution 2166 that requires all states to fully cooperate in all efforts to establish accountability. The Joint Investigation Team will continue its work, and this will lead to a Dutch national prosecution. Ukraine, the country where the crash occurred, has transferred all relevant legal jurisdiction to the Netherlands to enable the prosecution to proceed and to enable all victims to be represented. I point out that Ukraine has extradition arrangements with Russia. The Australian government remains absolutely committed to pursuing the perpetrators and holding them to account, and we have allocated over $50 million to enable the prosecution to proceed and also to ensure that the Australian families can also attend. Mr Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the many Australian officials from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, from Defence, from the Attorney-General's Department, from the Australian Federal Police and our intelligence community, who've played a significant role in our response to this crash and also the investigation from 2014, and their work is continuing. This atrocity represented a threat to global civil aviation safety, and we stand with the grieving families and with our international partners in the pursuit of answers and ultimately justice.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Thank you, and I'd rise to associate the opposition with the remarks of the Foreign Minister. Like many members of the House, I've had the sad privilege of meeting the families of the people who were murdered in 2014. 38 Australians were murdered, 298 people were murdered. We supported, when this terrible atrocity occurred, the strong actions of the then Prime Minister, the member for Warringah. We support again the government now and the actions of the Foreign Minister. We wholeheartedly agree with the conclusions of the international report about the origin of this murder weapon, and despite what the Russian ambassador to Australia has said, that these are merely reports on social media, they are most certainly not. And no amount of counter-rhetoric from the Russian Federation will dissuade the Australian government or opposition from the truth of what has happened. And I'd make these remarks on indulgence not just for the Australian people, but also to send a message to the Russian Federation that whatever the debates we have here, when it comes to the MH17 atrocity, this parliament is of one mind. There is no daylight, there are no shades of grey. The UN Security Council resolutions must be respected. We demand full transparency. Compensation we seek, not because there's not a single family member who wouldn't rather just have their loved ones back, but as a recognition of responsibility. The families of those people who were murdered deserve closure, and the Russian Federation should be on notice that this parliament unanimously supports the actions of the government.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last week, the member for New England said that the Prime Minister should take his $80 billion big business tax cut to the next election. Does the Prime Minister agree with the free advice offered by the member for New England? Can the Prime Minister confirm the government's commitment today is to implement its full company tax cut despite any obstacles?
The Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable member. Thank the honourable member for his question, and I can repeat the commitment that I've made. Thank you. Thank you. Repeat the commitment we've made to ensure that we secure a competitive company tax rate for Australian businesses. Indeed, on precisely the same basis as recommended by the member for McMahon in his own book. Copies available wherever remaindering occurs, Mr Speaker. There are great piles of it piling up. There are snowdrifts of that great work. And he said he was channeling his great idol, Paul Keating. You know, he swaggers around the house channeling PJK, he does. He smiling when I say that. He loves it. He's lapping it up. But you know what? When Keating said he was in favour of lower taxes for companies, he was different. He delivered. He was consistent. He delivered on lower taxes for precisely the reason that he knows, and we all know, that Australian business needs to have competitive tax rates, and we need that for precisely the reason that he's written in his book, the Leader of the Opposition has said, former Labor leaders have said, because it encourages more investment, higher productivity, more jobs and higher wages.
The member for Capricornia.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the minister update the House on action the government is taking to ensure Australian superannuation is protected, including for workers in my electorate of Capricornia? Is the minister aware of any other proposals?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I thank the member for Capricornia, who is such a hard-working member, for her question. She knows that Australians work incredibly hard for their retirement savings, and they are seeing so many of those superannuation savings disappear to excessive fees and charges, through high insurance premiums, through duplicate accounts and through underperforming funds. Every single week I receive letters from members, from individuals, from family members and from people in this House, both on this side of the chamber and on that side, who are concerned about the erosion of retirement savings. Just recently, I received a letter from a concerned sister who is writing on behalf of her brother. He has a disability. He has taken it upon himself to engage in the workforce, and good on him. And he was automatically enrolled in insurance coverage through his superannuation fund. This has cost him around $800 a month in premiums, a cost that has far exceeded his wages. So what is the net result of this? His superannuation nest egg has turned to nothing. It is a mandatory system, and it is simply not good enough, Mr Speaker, for superannuation retirement savings to be eroded in this manner. That is why, on this side of the chamber, the government has made significant announcements. It's actually an industry fund. I'm very happy to name it. You might not like it.
Members on both sides.
Right. I'm very happy to provide the Leader of the Opposition with those details. In a mandatory system, of course, we need to make sure that we protect the retirement savings of millions of Australians, which is why our government reform package is doing just that. We are not going to have young Australians or those people who have got low balances or those people with inactive accounts paying high insurance premiums. In fact, we are going to save them $3 million. $3 million in a 12-month period because they will not be forced to do this. We're also going to reunite people with their own money through the Australian Taxation Office. That is $6 billion of their own money that they will get back in their pocket as a result of our changes. And who is standing in the way of this?
I'd be interested to know.
It is the Leader of the Opposition, who is so shifty when he is asked about these questions. When he is asked whether he will support these reforms, he twists and he turns. But let us say this. It is so easy for you to report these reforms if only you would do that on behalf of the millions of Australians who will benefit.
The member for Franklin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that at 7:18 p.m. last Wednesday, every member of the government voted against Labor's plan to give 39,000 people in Braddon a tax cut of up to $928
Member for
a
Franklin
year?
will just resume or take a seat. Don't resume your own seat. The member for Deacon's warned. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The member for Franklin. The member for Goldstein's warned. And the member for Franklin can begin a question again.
Can the Prime Minister confirm that at 7:18 p.m. last Wednesday, every member of the government voted against Labor's plan to give 39,000 people in Braddon a tax cut of up to $928 a year, almost double the tax cut that they'll get from the government? And why didn't this Prime Minister vote for lower taxes for 10 million Australians, including people in the north and west coast of Tasmania, instead of giving an $80 billion handout to big business?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for the opportunity to respond. As we've heard, as I've quoted the member for Batman, according to the Labor Party, tax is not a burden, it's a privilege. They believe paying taxes is a privilege on that side of the House. That's why I'm not surprised they voted against a $140 billion package by trying to turn it into a $70 billion tax relief plan, Mr Speaker. That's what the Labor Party did. This just goes to show how they seek to hoodwink the Australian people. It's a very shifty practice. They're out there saying, oh, we're providing twice as much in tax cuts, when they came in here and cut the tax cut plan in half, Mr Speaker. They turned a $140 billion tax relief plan into a $70 billion plan, and then they go outside this place and say somehow they did the opposite. Mr Speaker, it's incredibly shifty. It's a very shifty way to represent themselves to the Australian people. What our personal tax plan does is it ensures that as Australians go about working in the economy, that they will not have to face the clawback of bracket creep, which will rob them from their increased earnings over the next decade. Someone who's on average wage, less than an average wage in fact, of just around $75,000, $76,000, they will face higher marginal tax rates under the Labor Party's plan than they will under the government's plan, Mr Speaker. So they need to be very honest with the people down there in Braddon. They need to tell them that they came into this place and turned a $140 billion tax relief plan into a $70 billion plan. But when it comes to the issue of companies, Mr Speaker, what we know is you need to be competitive. You need your businesses to be competitive, and the more tax they have to pay the government rather than investing in their own businesses does not make them competitive. And it was most recently with the report which was cited, the World Competitiveness Yearbook. The corporate tax rate on profit was the weakest ranking within the government efficiency category, coming in at 50 again, highlighting that to remain internationally competitive, this is an area that needs to be reviewed. Australia's tax rate for businesses is penalising those businesses from employing Australians, paying them higher wages, Mr Speaker, and creating more jobs. It is this side of the House, the Liberal and National parties, since we came to government, has created, with the absolute support of the Australian economy, going out there and doing the work, 1 million jobs and more, Mr Speaker. That's what's happened under the stewardship on economic management on this side of the House. On that side of the House, they've never seen a tax that they don't want to see higher, Mr Speaker, because at the end of the day, they think Australians should pay more tax, and under Labor, Australians will pay more tax.
The member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the minister update the House on how the recent budget continues to invest in keeping Australians safe, particularly through the government's naval shipbuilding plan? Have previous policy approaches invested in the defence and defence industry have ever changed to this extent before?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Gilmore for her question. Mr Speaker, the 2018 budget continues to invest in keeping Australians safe. It's one of the most important jobs of any government, and this government is doing so, and the 2018 budget are committed to that into the future. This government has a $200 billion commitment to building up our military capability over the next 10 years, the largest in our peacetime history, Mr Speaker. It's going to get us to 2% of GDP in 2020 being spent on defence, a year ahead of the promise that we made back a few years ago when we were elected, Mr Speaker. We're doing it because it's critically important to protect Australia's national interests, but we're using the opportunity of that $200 billion heft to drive innovation, jobs, investment and advanced manufacturing in Australia, Mr Speaker. That's the big difference between this side of politics and the Labor side of politics. We actually put our money where our mouth is, Mr Speaker. Companies like H.I. Fraser, in the member for McKellar's electorate, the Tasmanian company, Taylor Brothers Slipway, BlueScope Steel in Port Kembla, Tallis in Bendigo, Forjax Marine in Newcastle, Mr Speaker, Avalon Systems in Mawson Lakes and Jenkins Engineering Defence Systems. What these companies all have in common is they all work on the Air Warfare Destroyer program, a program initiated in the Howard government, Mr Speaker. A couple of weeks ago, we launched the latest of the Air Warfare Destroyers, the HMAS Sydney. Productivity had improved by 60% between Ship 1 and Ship 3, Mr Speaker. But you know what was really sad about that day? What was sad about that day is if Labor had been re-elected in 2013, that would have been the last naval vessel ever built in Australia, Mr Speaker. That would have been the last naval vessel built in Australia in an Australian shipyard. Labor would have closed down every shipyard in Australia. I hear them all interjecting, Mr Speaker. In 6 years of Labor, they made not one decision to build a ship in Australia. Not one in 6 years. I suppose in the 7th year they were limbering up for a big decision, were they, to build a ship in Australia. Under this government, Mr Speaker, we've commissioned 54 ships, 54 naval vessels, driving jobs, innovation, advanced manufacturing. This is a government that's getting on with it, and we can afford to do it because of the management of the budget by the Treasurer, and the Prime Minister ensures we've got the money to invest in our military capability, to protect our nation and its people, and to invest in Australian business, Australian jobs, Australian manufacturing, something Labor could only ever dream about.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Instead of giving an $80 billion handout to big business, why won't the Prime Minister support Labor's commitment to invest $10 million to establish a chemotherapy treatment service at Caboolture Hospital, meaning cancer patients in Longman won't have to travel long distances to get the care that they need?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'll ask the Minister for Health to add to this, but I want to record, with respect to Caboolture Hospital, the shocking lies that are being told by the Labor Party in Longman. Shocking lies. These are the facts. Mr Speaker,
members on both sides.
Mr Speaker, the government is spending a record amount on public hospitals in Queensland and in particular in the Metro North hospital network. The truck that the Labor Party is towing around Longman saying that the federal government is cutting funding to hospitals in Queensland, let alone at Caboolture Hospital, is a lie. It is an absolute lie. In fact, Mr Speaker, we've seen a 53% increase in funding to local hospitals in that area, including to Caboolture Hospital. And there is record GP bulk billing in that electorate of 93%.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Ballarat on a point of order.
On direct relevance,
Member
it was
for
a
Ballarat
question
will
around
resume her
10 million.
The Prime Minister has the call. Members on my right, the Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll ask the Minister for Health to complete the question, but the bottom line is this. Labor is lying about health. Every day it goes out saying that funding to hospitals and Medicare has been cut. It is a lie. Funding is going up every year, and in particular in that Metro North hospital area.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And let me give some very simple facts which deal with Labor's lies on hospitals. $21 billion, $22 billion, $23 billion, $24 billion. Record federal funding to hospitals each year, every state, every territory. But more significantly still, as the Prime Minister referred to the situation around the Metro North area, which Labor has been parading around without even saying a word about the truth of what state Labor has done to that region. Our funding in the last full financial year went up not 10, not 20, not $30 million, but $120 million. How much do you think Labor added to its own Metro North area, where Caboolture Hospital is located? It didn't add $10 million. It didn't add $20 billion. It certainly didn't add $30 or $120 million. It cut hospital funding to its own hospitals in the Caboolture area by $21 million. If there was a skerrick of honesty on health on the other side, they would have said something about that. And yet we've had the Shadow Minister, we've had the Leader, and we've had Susan Lamb say nothing. They are the Marcel Marceaus of hospital funding when it comes to Queensland Labor. In the end, we're increasing
the Minister's time has
Labor's
concluded. The member for Petrie.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is also to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister please outline to the House how a stronger economy enables the government to subsidise new medicines, including improving the lives of more than 500,000 Australian patients who have trouble breathing with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease? How does the government's management of the budget allow this to happen in comparison with previous approaches?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Petrie, who comes to this place as a small business owner and operator. Pest control, he can spot a cockroach at 30 paces. And one of the things that he learned is that in order to grow a small business, you need a plan and you need to work hard. And in order to grow an economy, you need a plan and you need to work hard. And in order to have that plan, you need to work on competitiveness to allow your businesses to flourish. And that's what allows 1 million jobs to be created. And that's what allows a government to guarantee essential services. And that's exactly what this government is doing. That's how we came to be able to provide record funding for Medicare, $4.8 billion of additional funding in the last budget, record funding for hospitals, an additional $30 billion over the new hospital funding agreement, record funding for aged care, up $5 billion, and record funding for mental health, up $338 million. Importantly, though, it also means we can provide record funding for new medicines with an ironclad guarantee that if the PBAC recommends it, we will list the new medicines. And on the weekend, I was privileged to be able to announce on behalf of the government that new medicines would be listed for conditions such as type 2 diabetes, ulcerative colitis, renal cancer, but in particular for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Now, for most people, the two things that they know most well in this case are emphysema and other related breathing diseases. And what that means is that we have been able to help 600,000 Australians access a simple, single, new medicine which would otherwise not have been available, which would have been out of the reach of the vast majority of Australians. So to put chronic obstructive pulmonary disease on the PBS is a very important thing. Now, I'm also asked, are there alternatives? Yes, there are. We hear from the Leader of the Opposition that this is just the ordinary course of business for government. It's not, because that hasn't always been the case. When Labor was in government, they deliberately denied 7 medicines from being listed on the PBS, including Symbicort. And what was Symbicort for? Asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So in the end, if you want to understand the difference between the two approaches to government, on that side, they can't manage the economy and therefore they can't manage health. They can't commit to delivering what people need. On this side, we manage the economy and we deliver the essential services.
The minister's time has concluded. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Director-General of the New South Wales Department of Education has said that extra funding will be needed to implement recommendations from the second Gonski report. If the Prime Minister has accepted the recommendations from this second Gonski report, why is he still cutting $17 billion from Australian schools while giving the big banks a $17 billion tax cut?
The Prime Minister has the floor.
I thank the honourable member for a question. Mr Speaker, the government is providing record funding to schools, the highest funding to schools in our history. And it is national, consistent and it's needs-based. And that record funding— well, the honourable member is shaking her head. The fact is the budget papers don't lie. The funding for schools is the highest ever. It is the highest ever, and the key thing that we have to achieve is to ensure that we get the best outcomes from this very large spending. And that is why David Gonski, whose recommendations my government has adopted and the honourable member's former government ignored and then misrepresented, that's why we need to know what are the measures that will ensure we give all of our students the best education that we can deliver. And the Gonski 2.0 report is a very valuable guide, and the Minister, Senator Birmingham, will be meeting with his counterparts from the states and territories to discuss how that can be implemented. And I have to say the report has been broadly well accepted. There's always some resistance to reform, but I think we all agree that every child should make a year's progress every year. And that is the fundamental point that David Gonski is making, because as they've observed in the report, there are many students who are not progressing as much as they should or could, and that is why we need to have a more student-focused approach to school education. The resources are there, the funding model is there. It's now important to put it to work for the benefit of our children.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is for the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of a unified and resolute approach to tackling criminal people smuggling syndicates? Minister, has the government's approach been successful, and would alternative ideas put this success at risk?
The Minister for Home Affairs. Member for Grayndler will cease interjecting.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member very much for her question. And, Mr Speaker, the reality is that the Labor Party at the moment is at war with itself The fact is, Mr Speaker, when it comes to border protection policies, the Labor Party is tearing itself apart. And, Mr Speaker, people across the country are completely bewildered with the position that the Labor Party now finds itself in. Mr Speaker, we have Labor candidates and Labor members of parliament who are clearing comments off their social media pages in relation to border protection policies. We even have, Mr Speaker, one of the senior frontbenchers within the Labor Party doctoring transcripts, providing false transcripts, even fabricating the words of the great David Spears from Sky News. In the transcript issued by the member for Barton, there was a complete and utter disconnect with what had actually been said during the course of the interview when she announced that the Labor Party would put time limits in place and would unwind the successful border protection policies of this government. Now, Mr Speaker, it doesn't stop there, because on the weekend there was a Victorian ALP conference, and, Mr Speaker, there was a motion that was to be put at that conference, and it said, and I quote, that the Labor Party should close the offshore detention centres, transit centres and other camps on Manus and Nauru within the first 90 days. Now, what happened during the course of that debate, Mr Speaker? What happened during the course of that debate where people would argue for and against strong border protection policies? You know what happened? The CFMEU rode into town on the Harleys. They hopped off, went inside, the debate was closed down. Then and there, Mr Speaker, the bikies within the CFMEU don't only muscle up on building sites, they turn up to convention centres where the Labor Party is seeking to conduct debate, and they closed the debate down. Now, Mr Speaker, what deal was done between this Leader of the Opposition and the CFMEU that they would move their block of considerable votes and stop this debate in relation to border protection? What backroom deal was done by this union leader, who now parades as a Leader of the Opposition? What dodgy deal was done that's not been disclosed to the Australian public? Well, we don't know, Mr Speaker, because it happened before the last election as well. The reality is, Mr Speaker, we have stopped boats. It's 1,402 days today since we had a successful people smuggling operation. It cost the Labor Party not only under their watch 1,200 people were drowned at sea, but $16 billion, money that can't be spent on frontline services. Never trust this Leader of the Opposition.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is it that under this Prime Minister, a former banker, the priorities are always the same? The biggest winners from his $80 billion handout are the big banks. The bosses who steal from their workers get let off without penalty and rewarded with a tax deduction. But everyone else in Australia is left to pay for the cuts to the pensions, to the hospitals, the schools and the TAFEs.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, what we've just heard is the summation of the Labor Party's litany of falsehoods, the way they insult the intelligence of the Australian people. Cuts to schools and hospitals. Well, Mr Speaker, what about this? Support for government schools rises from $7.7 billion to $9.7 billion from 2018-19 to 2021-22. Leader of the Opposition said we're cutting schools funding. False. We're increasing it. Support for non-government schools rises from $11.8 billion to $13.8 billion over the same period. That's up. That's increasing funding for schools. And then what about hospitals? Funding for hospitals increases every single year. And, Mr Speaker, the budget fully funds a new 5-year public hospital agreement with the states and territories that will deliver more than $30 billion in additional funding between 2021 and 24-25. And Commonwealth funding for public hospital services is on track to more than double, from $13.3 billion in 2012-13, last year of the Labor government, to $28.7 billion in 2024-25. Mr Speaker, The Labor Party thinks they can make a lie the truth by repeating it again and again, and they can't. Their claims that we have cut spending on schools and on health is false. It is demonstrably false. The numbers I've just read out prove that it's false, but it won't stop them, Mr Speaker, because they have no respect for the truth, they have no respect for the intelligence of the Australian people. They hold them in contempt by disrespecting them with one lie after the other. Record funding, guaranteeing essential services, bringing the budget back into balance a year earlier and ensuring that hard-working Australian families can keep more of the money they earn. That's what our budget delivers. Labor could not deliver that in government, and they are the biggest threat to the jobs, the health funding, the schools funding, the drugs listing that the Australian people face. The Labor government would be a train wreck to the economy and put all of that economic achievement at risk.
The member for Latrobe.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Small and Family Business, the Workplace and Deregulation. Will the Minister update the House on how businesses are benefiting from the government's policies to reduce red tape? What dangers do different approaches carry?
The Minister for Small and Family Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Latrobe for his question and his passion for reduction of red tape in his own seat of Latrobe. And I can inform the House, Mr Speaker, that the government is absolutely committed to reducing red tape, but more than that, it's delivering upon its promise to do so. The latest red tape report, released yesterday, shows red tape was reduced by $800 million in the last financial year alone. The government's regulatory reform agenda has cut compliance costs for individuals, business and community organisations by almost $6 billion since being elected in 2013. The biggest single saving, worth some $444 million of this, Mr Speaker, came from the abolition of Labor's Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal, the RSRT. And I'm asked about the risk. What are the dangers? The Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, put bluntly, is the danger. He had his hands on the RSRT and its formation from the start, when the Minister for Workplace Relations, and he did a deal with the TWU to get support for Julia Gillard to roll Kevin Rudd. This is an example of the sort of deal-making the opposition leader does when he looks after union mates ahead of all else. When it comes to doing dodgy deals with unions, the Leader of the Opposition has more angles than a protractor. The opposition leader has given the TWU a rolled gold undertaking that he will bring back the RSRT. Here's the danger. Here's the danger, Mr Speaker. This will put 35,000 jobs at risk in the transport industry alone. But what is the record of the Turnbull government in this sector? Over the past 5 years under the Turnbull government, 23,000 new businesses have opened in the transport sector, creating 70,000 of those 1 million jobs in the last 4.5 years. Under the last year, the danger again, under the last year of the Labor government, 5,500 transport businesses closed, and there was a reduction of 15,000 jobs in the sector. 70,000 created in 4.5 years, 15,000 lost in the last 12 months under Labor. That's the risk of the Leader of the Opposition and his deals with his union mates. You don't know, you cannot trust what the Leader of the Opposition says, and that's before, with the TWU, at least we know it. That's before we find out, after election, if elected, which we can't afford to happen, what deals he's done with John Sector and his CFMEU mates. In his secret deal, we know nothing about it. Even his front bench, his shadow front bench, are concerned about it, and that's the risk. And the member for Latrobe is right in raising that risk.
The Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime Minister.